Welcome to the Close the Chapter podcast. I am Kristen Boyce, a licensed marriage and family therapist with a private practice, Pathways to Healing Counseling. Through conversations, education, strategies, and shared stories, we will be closing the chapter on all the thoughts, feelings, people, and circumstances that don't serve you anymore and open the door to possibilities and the real you. You won't want to miss an episode, so be sure to subscribe. Welcome to this week's Close the Chapter podcast. You have come to the right place. Were you a former athlete? Maybe you were in elementary school, middle school, high school, college. Maybe you were a pro athlete after college. Maybe you did intramural sports. Maybe you know somebody, married to somebody, have a family member or a loved one that was an athlete and is having a hard transition, making that leap from being an athlete to not being in a team, not having structure, and they're not coping real well. Maybe they're using alcohol or other substances or really not feeling and dealing. Maybe they've suppressed and repressed things for years, childhood things, maybe a trauma that's happened, and they haven't dealt with it. This is the episode for you. We dove into all of those things. And then maybe you have a loved one that isn't interested in seeking help or therapy. We talk about that and what it's like as a family member and a friend and how to deal with it. We really took a deeper dive in looking at athletes. My guest today specifically talked about her friend who is an NFL player. And I don't think we talk a lot about what it's like to be an athlete, what it gives you in terms of your worth, your identity, structure, routine, how it impacts you when you don't have that anymore. And it's similar for other things. Let's say you're retiring there's many different ways you can insert not just athletics, but for this conversation, we focused on athletes. And it's something I don't think we talk about very often. And now many sports teams have a sports psychologist or a therapist on staff for a specific reason. Because if you're not dealing with the past, it's going to play out on the field or in the game or in your head and in your body. And there's going to be a high cost for not feeling and dealing. It's a huge, I would say, epidemic in the world that we're just suppressing and repressing and pushing it back down into the body. We talked about Simone Biles and her journey with mental health. It's a deep dive, and I am so glad you're here. So let me introduce you to our guest today. Dr. Dawn Whitaker is a visionary founder of WellEquined, a groundbreaking mental health and wellness program for former athletes. With over a decade of research and athlete transition, she is a dedicated advocate for promoting well-being and personal growth among athletes. WellEquined is the first program of its kind designed for former athletes utilizing equine-assisted therapy. We love horses. I'm telling you, it's groundbreaking and transformational. And they use equine-assisted therapy as its core therapeutic experience, among other things. We talked a lot about what it's like to know someone needs to really work through their past and the challenges it can be when they don't want to, especially for athletes, because there's so much into their worth and value, into performance and being part of a team. So it's a really deep dive. I encourage you to get the journal that's for free for your own well-being, for your own introspection, for your own self-awareness. And it's free. You can get it at Kristen, Kristen, Boyce, boice.com/free resources. So I hope this conversation is meaningful. If you're an athlete or you know an athlete or you're in a relationship with one, share this episode. Let's keep the conversation going about mental health and end the stigma that you don't have to be broken or have a major crisis in order to talk to somebody. So here's my conversation with Dr. Dawn Whitaker. Welcome to the Close the Chapter podcast. I am so delighted you're here with me. And Dawn, welcome to the show. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you so much for having me, Kristen. I really appreciate it. I'm so excited about talking to your audience about the healing journey and getting rid of anything that's no longer serving you. And so this is exactly what we want to talk about today.
I am so glad you are getting ready to tell me about how you got started with your doctorate and what you worked on. And so tell the audience kind of how this evolved for you.
Okay. So going back about 13 years, when I initially did my master's program, my focus was on transition from sport. And really what the catalyst for that was, I don't know if you know Junior Seau, the former
I do not.
San Diego Chargers. So we're going to talk a lot about sports today, but he was a former NFL player and he actually committed suicide. And it was really that event that kind of triggered this wondering for me, like, what's going on with these athletes after they leave their sport? We see them on the field. We see them in their highlight, top of the top of their game. And then after they're gone, we don't really like what happens with them. And we hear a lot about issues with anxiety, depression. We see things like what happened with Junior Seau. And so that, again, going back 12 years, when I said, well, let me do a research study. That's when I did my first research study on transition from sport to really get an understanding of what's going on with them after they transition. Fast forward to when I did my doctorate, I also focused on going back and looking at the collegiate experience of former NFL players and kind of understanding, well, what was impacting their ability to prepare for transition at that time? What were the barriers? And so taking all of this and rolling it into today, that's when I created Athlete Elevation Network, because I wanted to find ways to help athletes in all aspects of their lives and their careers and at different stages, whether it's the preparation or even afterwards. So I was established that business. I was helping athletes on an individual basis. And I realized there's this great need for mental health support. And it's not really being addressed. At least it's not being addressed to the level that it should be, if I could say that. Or there isn't participation. And a lot of that lack of participation is because of the stigma that is surrounded around seeking mental health support, especially for athletes, because they have this persona of being invincible and strength. And so the stigma may look at it like them feel like, okay, I'm admitting weakness if I'm seeking help. And that's not the case. It's really a strength that you're seeking help. So sorry, I'm long-winded on this answer, but
I love this. Keep going.
I was helping a particular former NFL player who was really struggling with depression, and it turned into alcohol abuse, and it got very bad. I watched him kind of deteriorate, not only mentally, but physically. It was really negatively impacting his body and his organ. And this being somebody close to me that I cared about, I thought, what can I do to help? And I felt helpless at that point because it's like, okay, I'm not going to therapy. I don't need help. I'm not going to rehab. And it's like, okay, what can I do? So that's when I started looking for alternative therapeutic methods. And I came across equine assisted therapy. And as I looked into it, I saw there's all these programs for veterans, for first responders, dealing with the depression, PTSD, which a lot of athletes have undiagnosed PTSD we can talk about. But it's really beneficial. It's working for these other groups, but there's no programs for former athletes. And so I said, I'm going to create one. So that's kind of where we got here. And I thought, okay, if I can help my friend with his struggles with the equine therapy, I can help other athletes because I know that a lot of them are going through the same thing. So that's how WellEquined was born. Equine therapy, of course, is an alternative form of therapy, but it's also, and you're as a psychotherapist, it is psychotherapy, but it's different from that traditional sit down in an office talking to a therapist, although you're still talking, but now you're not out in nature, you're outside. And so not only do you have that benefit of the therapy, but you also have the benefit of connecting to nature. And it's easier to become present and centered when you have all of these other things going on and you're not as vulnerable. I find this with athletes, they don't feel as vulnerable as when they're sitting in an office where it feels a little more structured. So they have that freedom of being out in nature. And so we find that it's really beneficial. They seem to kind of let their guard down easier when they're out in that environment. And so we want to promote that more for athletes because obviously we want them to get the benefit of this type of therapy so that they can begin their healing journey.
So did your friend end up going to the equine therapy?
He did. And it's funny. I'm going to tell you the first thing that he said. First, he said, I'm not touching a horse. So I think this is important because people who have an aversion, as long as they give it a chance, they'll see the benefits. The first thing he said when he came out of the arena was, I get it now. And it was like an epiphany. It was just like an epiphany. I wasn't in the arena with him because he's in there with the psychotherapist and with the equine specialist and the horses. But I was off afar and I could see, and I looked over and I saw him connecting with the horses. He was smiling. And I thought, this is amazing. This is great. Because who would have thought that somebody with that much of an aversion to even, he hated horses. He said, I'm not touching one. And it was just like I said, it was an epiphany. So it was wonderful. And he said, I want to come back every week. Can't necessarily come back every week, but we can reintroduce it as much as possible. He said, I want to bring my son. I mean, it was just like, it's like opening a new door. The other thing I wanted to say about WellEquined is we're combining the equine assisted therapy also with mindfulness practices. And we found that the combination works very well. And in particular, we use the harmonium healing system. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
I'm not.
It's very different from probably anything that you've seen before, but is like a mindfulness practice. The best way to describe it is 1 hour of harmonium healing is equivalent to 40 hours of meditation as far as what it takes your body through. It's like a cellular restart for your body and healing system. And those are actually individual sessions. It's not group. Like if you were to do a group breathwork session, for instance. So what we found is during equine therapy, a lot of feelings come up. They may come up during the therapy. They may come up an hour later. They may come up a week later. But as you know, that type of therapy will bring up things that you have suppressed for a long period of time or didn't allow yourself to connect to. And so then it's like, okay, these feelings are here. So what do we do with them? And we have to learn how to process them or at least address them, right? Because what causes so many issues is just that suppression, and then it manifests into mental issues, emotional issues, physical issues. If you are just suppressing those issues, or those feelings, we want to get them up and we want to get them out in process. So the harmonium helps with that. And so it's almost like a complete system. I talk about it sometimes as reflect, release, restore. And so the reflection is the equine therapy because the horses are actually living biofeedback machines. They are reflecting back to you exactly what you're putting out. They can feel what's going on inside of you. And you can't be as a horse. So you can't say I'm fine and you're not like you can a human. They are so intuitive and they can tell exactly what's going on with you and they allow you to see yourself. And that's a part of that benefit. So the reflect is the mirror. You're with the horse mirror. Release is whichever mindfulness practices we incorporate. We're starting to use breath work in the middle to help with that release. Harmonium also releases, but just add that extra layer. We have breath work in the middle. It helps you with the release. Those emotions came up, release, and then restore. So the harmonium piece is a restorative healing on the cellular level that kind of ties it all together.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about harmonium. I've never heard of it. Tell us what it is exactly. So for those listening are like, okay, what does that mean? What does that entail?
Okay, harmonium is a system. The best way to describe it is or similarities. It's similar to, I guess you could say, Reiki.
Reiki, like energy work.
It's energy work. And so you're actually laying on the table and there are particular sounds that are emanating that are frequencies that help you heal on a cellular level. And I'm sorry, I don't give the full description because I'm not the harmonium expert, but I did bring the harmonium into the picture. But this process allows you to focus on being present and processing those emotions. And so it drops you into a very deep state of relaxation that helps everything kind of process.
Your nervous system kind of come back to center. Okay.
Yes. It's like a nervous system reset.
Okay. Let's talk about PTSD in athletes because you had mentioned that. You said a lot of athletes have PTSD. Can you share more about that?
I do. What I'd like to say is, and I know you know this, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but for your listeners, PTSD is you don't have to have experienced it yourself, trauma. You could have witnessed it. And I don't know how much your listeners know about sports, but when Denny Hamlin was a football player last year who basically his heart stopped on the field and everyone stopped. And they brought out the defibrillator, however you say that, and they got his heart beating again. But he literally died on the field. Every single player on that field has some type of trauma because they see themselves in that person. Anytime you experience or witness trauma, you embody that. And so that's the emotional trauma. Then physical trauma, we want to talk about and I know I talk a lot about football players, but it applies for all sports, primarily football. The nature of the sport is traumatic in itself on your body, on your brain. And so they continue to just play, push through the pain, not address what's going on, maybe emotionally, physically, just keep pushing because they have to go on. They have to win. They have to play at the highest level. And so that will embody PTSD. Or I don't want to say everybody has PTSD, but some level of trauma that's unaddressed because they figure, okay, I'm an athlete. I'm supposed to push through it. I'm not supposed to feel some kind of way or pain or weakness. I'm going to push through. So I do want to say that I even talked to athletes who were watching that particular incident at home on TV and they experienced the trauma. You didn't even have to be there in person. And so I've looked at some studies where it talks about PTSD in athletes. A lot of times it's undiagnosed because they're not admitting. So the numbers for athletes across the board for a lot of mental health issues are going to be lower than the actual numbers just because we don't want to admit anything that could be perceived as weakness. And so that's another thing that we're trying to push through is just to promote, again, reduce that stigma and promote seeking healing and seeking working on your mental health because it's so important. They spend so much time working on their physical health and they need to spend just as much time working on their mental health.
Do you think that the athletes pushing through the pain because they've got to win, they need to be at their best optimal performance. And then when they transition out of athletics, and now is that when all of that starts to manifest itself because you're not pushing as much, you're not go, 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 you're not in as many practices. Is that when all of that trauma and that transition can make it hard because it's now bubbling up to the surface because there's like space for it to come through?
That, and then also, if you think about it in sports, their lives are so structured. You have practice at this time, you have a game at this time, you have your training at this time, you meet with the nutritionist at this time. Everything is so structured and you have your team. And so you have that camaraderie. And then once they're no longer playing, especially if it's due to injury because it's involuntary and it's sudden, which is way worse. Once they're no longer playing, they lose all of that. And they don't have that structure anymore and they kind of become lost. Like, okay, well, what am I supposed to do? Because I knew what I was supposed to do at all times before. Now I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I don't know what I'm going to do on a daily basis for that matter, or for a career, or if they haven't planned properly. And then also they've been doing this for so long, their entire lives, right? And so their identity is tied to that. And now there's an entire identity shift. And so literally lose their identity and you're not going to get it back. You're no longer going to be that football player, basketball player, rugby player, whatever you were. That was such an important part of your life. It's almost like processing grief. And if you don't process it, which oftentimes they won't, or they don't, because they don't really know what's going on, now you're harboring that feeling of feeling lost, feeling uncertain, not knowing what to do. And then that will manifest into a lot of these feelings of anxiety, depression, and, worse.
Addictions. I feel like what I see too is people have buried trauma from their childhood or something in the past has happened. They've buried it and they focused on athletics, which has helped them have an identity and a sense of belonging. And then if they get injured or something along those lines, or they're no longer part of the team, there is so much shame too, I feel like, of not feeling good enough. And then all of the stuff from the past is still living in the nervous system. And I find that drinking and other substances really ramp up. Do you see a correlation between substance use and self-medicating, kind of the shame or what they've buried?
Absolutely, because they don't know how to deal with it. If they were very well informed about, okay, this is what this is. Let me identify this. This is a feeling from my childhood trauma that I haven't addressed. Let me go to therapy. Let me address this. Like, find healthy ways to deal with it. They instead typically unhealthy coping mechanisms, which are what you were talking about, the addictions, drinking, maybe prescription drugs, whatever helps them negatively cope with what's going on inside of them. That really needs to be addressed in a healthy way.
Yeah, I think this is something that if we could normalize more, which is what you're on a quest for, to talk about athletes, and because there's specific things that athletes can relate to. You're talking about, well, you have structure in your day, then that goes away. You get an injury, and then who are you? What's your worth? What's your value? What are you going to do with your life? Like, what's your identity if you've played this your whole life? I feel like there's so much grief, sense of identity shift, and ways to cope with it are, like you said, they don't know how. So when someone makes a transition, maybe they're a collegiate athlete and they're no longer playing a sport, let's just say, because I see that a lot, a collegiate athlete, or somehow they've got an injury and now they're not playing. What are some of the coping mechanisms and ways to deal with that shift and that transition and that identity kind of crisis, so to speak?
So I think it's very important to focus on self-reflection. And that's something that they don't do. It's something you have to learn. And that is one of the things that is fostered at WellEquined or during equine therapy is self-reflection. You're forced to kind of look at yourself and go, check in with yourself and say, hey, what's going on? What is this that I'm feeling? What is this emotion that every time it came up before, I just kind of said, well, I don't know what that is. Push it away. A lot of times they find that they just terrible, but they just push it down. Starts to come up and they say, I don't want to deal with that. Let's push
So that's
it down.
how they were trained. I mean, to push it down.
You're feeling bad, push it away. You got to get out there on the field. You got to win. And so that's ingrained in them for so long. It's such a part of who they are. I mean, can you imagine and now you're no longer that athlete. What do you do? So to answer your question, the best thing to do is to just look within, start focusing on self-reflection, introspection. And if you're not going to therapy, which I think everybody should, because it helps, check in, get a journal and write down whatever comes up. You don't even have to I think guided journals are great if you don't know what to write or you need kind of a push. But I also am a huge advocate for blank journals. And here's why. I think that just whatever's coming up, just get it out. It doesn't even need to be legible. I always tell, because we provide journals for the athletes at WellEquined, and I always tell them, it doesn't matter if you can read it, get it out and put it on paper. It's up, it's out. You're no longer suppressing it. And now once it's up, you can deal with it accordingly and you can deal with it in healthier ways. But just always keep that journal with you. Don't push your emotions down. That's kind of like the recurring theme here, right? Just get it out. Pay attention to what is going on with you. And I'm sorry, did I answer that last question?
Yeah, it was how to cope. And I think
Okay.
a lot of what I find with a lot of athletes is they don't really want to feel, especially if they're still playing. Like they don't really want to feel because then what if they can't play the game? What if it affects their game? What if it affects them mentally? And what I'm saying is you not feeling is actually affecting you mentally more than if you would feel you're actually going to play better. Do you find
Yes, and
that?
I'm so glad you said that because you just reminded me of it. I always use her as an example. She's amazing. Simone Biles. And I don't know if you saw, I'm sure you watched the Olympics or heard about it, but she had therapy every day. She realized she's a huge advocate for mental health. And I'm so thankful for her because she's not only an athlete, but she's top of her game. And so it lets you know you can be focusing on your mental health, which actually helped her perform better and be a top athlete. And so that's a great example is you do need to address and not harbor those feelings and push them down to actually help you perform better.
That's the thing I loved about Simone. I was like, yeah, I was so excited that she was promoting and she recognized when she was at the Olympics before, she realized what a toll it took on her and that she had to focus on her mental health because it was impacting how she was feeling and performing. So to me, that was so amazing that she came public and said, I'm talking to my therapist while I'm here at the Olympics. I was like, yes,
Yes.
Simone.
Yes. That she's the best example for that. Absolutely. And
I
there are
100%
other
agree.
athletes coming forward who are starting to talk about
Caitlin Clark here in
Caitlin
Indianapolis.
Clark. Yes. And I'm so happy about that because it's starting to normalize and the conversation around mental health and the importance.
So, where is the clinic you run? Where is that? Tell us where it is. How does it run? Like, if someone's like, I kind of am interested in this, how do they even find out?
Okay. So this is how we're set up. We're actually at a private ranch in kind of the Malibu, Westlake Village area. We don't disclose the address, until the day that people are coming. But the best way to reach us is to go to the website, which is wellequined.com and sign up for the interest list. And we'll reach out to you, talk to you. You can either sign up for an existing program that we have and we'll post them on the website. We say we have one coming up in October, for instance, October 27th. You can sign up for that. Or if you express interest and you would like to do individual sessions, we can absolutely curate individual sessions for you. And so it's not just the equine therapy, it's the whole package, right? It's the equine therapy, the mindfulness practices, and the harmonium healing system to tie it all together. And then we have a few other things. We provide wellness gift bags where we give the athletes particular tools that can help them even after they leave and things they can incorporate into their daily lives that kind of continue that healing that they had during that experience. But best way to connect with us is just to go to the website, again, wellequined.com, and leave your information and we can do whatever you need.
Is there anything we didn't cover about athletes and recovery and finding healing that was important?
Finding healing, let me see. I think we covered most of it. The most important thing is just I always like to make this correlation with athletes. And I might have mentioned it before, but they spend so much time working on their physical health. Their physical health and their training is so important for what they're doing as a career, what they're doing in life. And they neglect oftentimes their mental health. And so the most important thing is to pay as much attention to your mental health as you do your physical health because it's your whole body wellness is what's important.
If someone says, I have a loved one that's an athlete, similar to your experience, and they do not want to get the help, like they don't want to go to therapy, they don't want to do equine therapy, they don't really want to get help, they're like pretty blocked off or resistant, if you will, for multitude of reasons. How would you approach them? Because I get asked this question a lot. How would you approach them about getting support?
That's a great question. And I've dealt with that myself. And where I always go is just try it. And like I said with my friend, that just try it. I was so averse to trying it. How is that going to help? How is talking to anybody, even when I was talking about regular therapy, how is talking to anyone going to help? They have this block up. And so you just have to get them to try it if you can, because once they do, they'll see. Their eyes will open and they'll say, just like I told you about my friend, he said, I get it now. I mean, big, huge football player. I'm not touching horses. And he's in there smiling and connecting and talking about, I want to come back. I didn't make that happen. He saw it for himself just by trying it. So if you can get them to try, and I tried for a long time, and I know it's difficult and it's frustrating, especially with family members or people that you care about, because I went through this. You see them struggling. And oftentimes, especially with athletes, they're struggling in silence because they don't want anybody to know what's going on really. And it's difficult. Like I said, it's very frustrating. So it took a long time for me to get him to get to that place. And like I said, I was watching him deteriorating for a long time. It's so hard. I found the equine therapy and I said, just try it, just try it. It was probably, I want to say realistically, it was probably about 6 months of me just saying, please try it before he said yes. And he was so glad he did. And I think that's just, I don't know if I answered the question, but that's a very difficult place to be, but just getting them to try before it's too late. Because even with him, his organs started to shut down and it was almost too late before he got help. And so you really have to intervene, especially when you see that loved one utilizing these unhealthy coping mechanisms or addiction or whatever is going on. You need to interject and just get them to try. The thing about equine therapy is there are studies that show that people who don't resonate with the typical talk therapy, I mentioned this earlier, they do resonate with equine therapy. And so it's almost like when you're talking to a loved one, if you say, hey, try this, this is not exactly like the therapy that you are used to hearing about. This is something different. And so that could be something that you could utilize in trying to get them to try something new is explaining, hey, this is a little different. It's actually enjoyable. You're really going to enjoy it. You're barely going to even know that you're in therapy because you're having such a good time and you're relaxed. And I also want to mention this. I don't know how much you know about equine therapy.
Big fan.
Yeah, big fan. But just being in the presence of horses is immediately going to calm you. And calming you is going to put you in that space of being present and helping with your self reflection. Everything about it is beneficial. And so, yeah, if you can just get them to try, I think that would be the best thing.
I know it's really hard on the loved ones that see a deterioration of the person they really care about because they're not dealing and feeling, they're suppressing and repressing. And they know the more they do that, the worse it gets, the bigger the issues get, the bigger the feelings get because you're not dealing with them. They don't go away, they grow because you're not processing them. And I think that's one of the hardest parts on family members or friends watching loved ones go through this, because you see them drinking their feelings away, using substances, and it's just holding it into the body and making this situation and their feelings exacerbated. And so this idea of just try it. And I know a lot of people are afraid that their loved one's going to get mad at them or push them away, especially parents. They're like, I don't want to push my kid away. I don't want them to be mad at me. I think the more I say it, the more they push away. What do you say to those folks that are afraid to push someone away, like maybe their child or a loved one that they care about, by saying, just try it? And they're like, stop talking about this. Leave me alone with this. What would you say to somebody that's in that kind of situation? Because I have several clients I can think of that in those situations with an athlete, with a collegiate athlete or a family member that was an athlete and now is not an athlete, but they're kind of seen them over the years deteriorate or increase their substance use.
Yeah, I'm still going to go. I know that's difficult. I'm still going to go with explaining that it's different and just try it. I'd still have to keep going to that. And here's why. I actually have my daughter my adult daughter, she has an aversion to therapy. We've gone through various different things. And I've talked to the psychotherapist at the ranch about my daughter. And, she's not an athlete, but I said, just try it. And she said she would. And that other things I have mentioned in the past, he has responded the way that you're describing with your client. She has responded, that's a waste of time. I don't want to do that. Leave me alone. That she has responded in those ways. Maybe because it's horses, it's more palatable. But I think that I would still say just try it. I think because it's horses, it makes it more palatable because it's like, what is this? Unless somebody has an aversion to, or, a hatred of horses, which who could have a hatred of horses? But even the football player I was talking about, he didn't like horses. And when I say he didn't like horses, it's because he's really afraid of horses, but he didn't want to say that, right? Because he's a football player, masculine athlete. But that's really what I don't like horses is I'm afraid of. But we're not going to say that out loud. And then once they're there and they feel that comfort and that calm being in their presence, I think they'll see and they'll appreciate that your clients actually suggested that they come out and do something like that.
Yeah, I love that. If people are interested in finding you, Dr. Donna Whitaker, where can they find you? Where can they find more about the program?
Yes, absolutely. The program, we have tons of information. We have frequently asked questions. You can go all over on the website. It's wellequined.com. And let me spell it WellEquined.com. And yeah, just everything is there. You can email me. You can put your information. We'll get back to you and we can talk about what the possibilities are, what your needs are, and we can get you on your journey to healing.
Thank you so much. We'll also put it in the show notes. Appreciate your heart and your soul. And thank you for the work you're doing in the world. And thanks for joining us, Dr. Donna Whitaker.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to the Close the Chapter podcast. My hope is that you took home some actionable steps along with motivation, inspiration, and hope for making sustainable change in your life. If you enjoyed this episode, click the subscribe button to be sure to get the updated episodes every week and share with a friend or a family member. For more information about how to get connected, visit Kristen, KRISTEN, Boyce, BOICE.com. Thanks and have a great day.